Ushoran, the Lord of Masks, the Undying King, the Mortarch of Delusion. One of the first 12 true-born vampires, he is an ancient, powerful and terrible legend possessed of unimaginable power and an insatiable thirst for human blood. Over the course of today's video, I'm going to show you my take on how to paint this terrifying vampire lord in a grimdark, realistic and sinister style. I am Black Chalice Studio, and you are watching the Grimdark Compendium. Since he was first released, Ushoran has been one of my favourite sculpts that Games Workshop have ever produced, full of menace, character and atmosphere. As always though, I felt like putting a personal touch towards this miniature. I added a tattered shawl made from cheesecloth to cover some of the large expanse of cape, and also scratch built some meat hooks and chains to mirror the ones on the back of the original sculpt. You guys know how much I love my pre-weathering stages, so we're going to come in first of all with some physical abrasion, using a sharp scalpel blade. I work my way across the armour and weapons here, adding small scratches, cuts and dents to simulate battle damage. And we'll follow this up by coming in with a surface manipulation technique on the flesh of the miniature. For those of you that haven't yet seen this technique, it's quite simple and very effective. By applying extra thin plastic cement to an area of the miniature, it will melt the top layer of plastic, then we can come in with an old stiff bristle brush, tap, dab, pull and poke at the area to create interesting and varied textures. One of my favourite ways of adding extra detail and character to a miniature is by the use of texture mediums. For the metallic parts of this miniature, like the weapon and the armour, I'm going to come in with AK Corrosion Texture Paste. I'll begin by diluting it slightly with water until you reach the consistency shown here, and then go about adding this into the crevices and around details. I'll then come back for a second pass where I wipe most of it off my brush and stipple it onto the larger flat armour panels. This texture shows up really well when we use enamel washes in the painting stages. Our second and final texture here today is going to be Vallejo Thick Mud. For my first application, I thin it slightly with water, wipe the majority of it from my brush, and then begin stippling it onto the cape, working from the bottom and moving up towards the top, getting lighter as we go. I do this over a couple of passes, just building it up gradually, and then I'll come in with a neat application, applied more towards the bottom of the cape, where it meets the ground. This is the area that we want the thickest, muddiest texture. With the pre-weathering stages complete, this is how we're looking so far. Moving on to the priming stage, I'm going to use Stynel Res Black, applied through the airbrush at around 25 psi over 2 to 3 thin coats. And for the base coat on the skin, we use GW Deepkin Flesh, applied over 2 to 3 thin passes in a zenithal manner through the airbrush once again. And for the highlights, we add a touch of Pro-Acryl Bold Titanium White and repeat the same process, just focusing on the high points such as the face, the top of the arms, anywhere we want to make pop. The base coat for the fur is Vallejo Medium Olive. This is applied through the airbrush as well. Just try to be careful not getting it on the skin here. While I had the airbrush out, I carefully came in with the skin base colour again and painted all of the heads and skulls on his back. And finally, to add some colour filters onto areas of his skin, I came in with GW Carroburg Crimson, applied over 2 to 3 very thin layers, just gradually building up the saturation of the colour. For the first round of highlights, the pelt on his back, I did a touch of Deepkin Flesh to the medium olive, thinned it down fairly heavily, and applied a few stippling passes. For the second highlight pass, I did a touch more white and repeated the same procedure again, concentrating more towards the outer edges of the pelt. I also used this mix to do a couple of very light dry brush passes over the rest of the fur on his back. Here you can see all of the other base coats I applied to the miniature. For the metals, such as the bronze, I used a stippling technique, gradually building up the opacity and a little bit of texture over a few layers. For the first round of highlights on the cape, I took the base colour, added a touch of Proacryl Bold Pyrrole Red and stippled on 2 to 3 layers, gradually building up the saturation. And we come back in again with a touch more Bold Pyrrole Red for the final highlight, working our way more towards the bottom of the cape with each layer. And finally for the shawl, we add a touch of Deepkin Flesh to the base colour and apply 2 to 3 dry brush layers, working our way more towards the bottom each time. With all the base coats and initial highlights applied, this is how we're looking so far. Moving on to our first unifying wash, which will be the metals, one of my absolute favourites from Villainy Ink Phase 2, Decrepit Filth. This is a wonderful dark brown blackish wash that I apply directly from the pot, no dilution. Just one even coat is enough here. If you get any pooling, go back in with the damp brush and mop up any excess. I'll then come in with a blow dry or medium heat for around 30 seconds just to flash this off so it looks dry to the touch. Then I'll leave the wash alone for around 15 to 20 minutes before I come back in. On the metals, I use the simplest form of the reductive technique, just coming in with the Q-tip dampened with spirits, tapping and dabbing at the surface, removing the excess, leaving it in the recesses and the crevices. For the unifying wash on the shawl, we'll come in with a 2-to-1 mix of Goon's Grime and Decrepit Filth. I'm fairly sparing with this application, giving everything just a once over and going back with a second coat for the deeper recesses and folds. Our unifying wash for the plume of hair on his back is going to be neat Goon's Grime. This is applied fairly heavily and I don't mind it pooling in the recesses and the area at the bottom where it meets the back. And last up, for the skulls on his back, we're going to come in with neat Goon's Grime with just a touch of Ichor of the Damned added to darken it up. I'll also push this onto the fur around the skulls just to outline them a little bit. Moving back to the shawl, I'll come in for an initial basic removal pass using a Q-tip fairly heavily loaded with spirits. The aim here is simply to reactivate the unifying wash that we applied earlier. I'll then swap over to a brush and keep making multiple downward strokes, creating a varied, streaked and mottled look where we remove the wash. Now we're going to bring some shading and separation and add some colour to the fur on his back. For this, I take Huntsman Green from Villainy Ink Phase 2 and add a small amount of Decrepit Filth just to darken it up a little bit. Huntsman Green is a lovely pale, sickly colour with strong undertones of ochre, which is perfect for our application here, giving us a look of mangy and filthy fur. I'll begin the removal pass on the pelt areas using a lightly loaded Q-tip with spirits, gently taking some of the wash away from the outer and raised edges. We're then going to swap over to a brush lightly dampened with spirits just to refine and clean these areas off a little bit more where I want less of the pronounced wash effect, slowly revealing the original colour underneath. For the fur, I'm going to come in with a Q-tip moderately loaded with spirits and keep tapping and dabbing at the entirety of the area just to reactivate the wash. We're not really looking to remove anything here. With that done, I'll come in with a clean, flat brush with a tiny bit of spirits on it and once again make these downward strokes, removing the wash from the raised areas of the hair, leaving it nice and dark in the crevices. I use the same technique on the plume of hair on his back. All we're looking to do is reveal the base colour on the high points of the fur, leaving the recesses nice and dark and grimy. Our final unifying wash today is going to be for the cape, and for this I use a 1-to-1 mix of Phase 2 Caput Mortem and Decrepit Filth. This will create a really nice reddish brown, almost purple tone, which is perfect for shading that ancient and dusty cape. Back to the blow dryer again, medium heat for around 30 seconds, just until the wash looks touch dry, then I'll give it 15 minutes before we come back in. When it comes to the removal pass, I'm only concentrating on the tops of the folds here, leaving the wash nice and pronounced in the recesses. We want this cape looking old, nasty and grungy. And we've finally come to the point where we can start putting some colour and substance into this guy's skin. I'll thin down a 3:1 mix of Dystopian brown and Colia green with a tiny bit of spirits just to make it flow better, and apply this in 2 to 3 controlled glaze layers over the entirety of the skin. This colour combination, along with the pigments found in Colia green, will give the skin a nasty, old necrotic look. And to take care of the shading on the recesses of his skin, we're going to come in with the previous mix plus a touch of Vicar of the Damned and use this like a crevice wash. I adopt a different technique for the removal pass on the skin here. To begin with, I'll load up one side of a Q-tip lightly with spirits and begin tapping and dabbing at a certain area. I'll then swap over to the dry side to gently feather the wash away. Using this technique allows for some incredibly smooth blends and also the opportunity to add some really nice mottling onto the skin. With the initial pass complete using the Q-tip method, I'll switch over to a brush lightly dampened with spirits and refine certain areas that I want a cleaner finish, such as the face, the top of the arms, places like that. Now we've completed all of the initial unifying washes, this is how we're looking so far. The first effect we're going to apply today is going to be the rust on the metallics. For my initial pass, I come in with a neat application of sector rust. I apply this in a nice, neat, even layer to the areas that I want that basic rust coloration. After my initial pass, I'll come back with a second one just to reinforce the saturation of the colour in certain areas like the deep crevices. In a similar manner to how we handled the removal pass on the fur, I'm just going to come in with a Q-tip lightly dampened with spirits here and reactivate the wash on the metallic parts. We're not looking to remove too much here, we're just getting it ready for the next step. With the wash reactivated in the previous step, I'm going to come back in with a brush and some spirits and gently feather the rust away from the areas that I want a cleaner finish. For our second rust pass, we're going to use some Ex Machina. This brighter, more orangish tone is going to be reserved mainly for the crevices and around prominent details. This is also applied in a deliberate manner in small amounts, just building it up slowly. As with the previous rust step, we're going to come in with a brush and some spirits and gently feather away any hard edges where we applied the wash, making a nice smooth transition. To add a bit of shade into the previous two rust steps and tone them down just a little bit, we're going to come in with Decrepit Filth, slightly thinned with mineral spirits, as a crevice wash. This is applied very deliberately in small amounts, just to the deepest recesses. Moving over to Dirty Down Rust, slightly diluted with water, we're going to apply this in small patches to the areas that we want a brighter, more yellowish tone. We'll then come in with Neat Dirty Down, applied to the areas that we want that deeper, darker, more reddish brown tone. I'm quite selective with this pass, just concentrating mainly on the deepest crevices. Our final rust step here is going to be taking some Dirty Down that's congealed and nearly cured and applying it in small blobs to the deepest crevices. This will give that really dark, crusty red look. To pop some contrast on the metals and add some surface finish variation against the dead matte and powdery rust, we're going to come in for a highlight pass. On the flat places of armour, I thin it down slightly and stipple a couple of coats on, concentrating on the high points. And for the more detailed places like his bangles and on his weapon, I apply lots of small lines and dots in places that light would naturally catch. For our verdigris effect on the bronze, we're going to make a 1:1 mix of Colia green and phase 2 All Is Dust. This combination is one of my absolute favourites and gives a nice powdery, chalky, old and decrepit looking verdigris. This is applied fairly sparingly to areas of the bronze that would naturally oxidise. To add an extra hint of colour here, we're going to come in with a neat pass of Colia green, applied more towards the deeper recesses and around prominent details. For the removal pass on the verdigris, we're keeping it really simple. Just come in with the Q-tip moderately loaded with spirits and take the wash away from just the very prominent edges. To add a touch of contrast and a little bit of shade into the verdigris here, along with some surface finish variation, we're going to take the base mix of Colia green and All Is Dust, add a touch of Vicar of the Damned and apply this as a very fine crevice wash. As we did with the silver metals, we're now going to come in, pop some contrast and add some very subtle highlights to the bronze. I'll take the base colour, add a touch of silver, thin it down a fair bit and wipe a lot of the pigment off my bristles, then come in with a stippling pass over the larger, more broad areas. Once again, for the more detailed areas, we'll just apply lots of small dots and lines along the leading edges and places that light would naturally fall. To add a bit of colour variation onto the shawl on his back, we're going to come in with some neat decrepit filth and apply it like a crevice wash to the deeper recesses and around the top of the shawl where it meets the fur. I'll apply this over a couple of layers, building up that deep, dark, brown, blackish colour with lots of nice pigmentation. Coming back in with a brush and some spirits here, we're just going to work away at softening the transitions where we applied the wash in the previous step. To punch up the contrast on the fur on his back and add some separation, we're going to take Goon's Grime, add a touch of decrepit filth and use this like a recess wash. For the shading wash on the plume of hair on his back, we're going to take Goon's Grime and add a touch of Ichor of the Damned. I apply an initial wash carefully and deliberately to the crevices between where the clumps of hair are. I then come back with a second, heavier application to the area where the plume meets the back. I want this area to have a slick, grungy and really dirty look. For the feathering pass on the fur for the wash we just applied, I'm just going to use a Q-tip moderately loaded with spirits. I'll concentrate mainly on the pelt areas here, cleaning any overspill from the wash up, and for the areas of fur, I'll just take the wash away from any raised details. And I use the same method for his plume of hair, just taking the wash away from the raised edges and details, leaving the crevices nice and dark. Now we're moving on to my favourite part of this miniature, bringing that skin to life. Our first filtering pass is going to be Villainy Ink Phase 2 Caput Mortem. This is a wonderful dark red, magenta, almost purple tone, which is absolutely brilliant for skin. I apply this directly to the areas I want the coloration, almost in the same way that you'd apply an acrylic paint. This also has a lot of particles in that help give a mottled and varied finish. Because we applied the Caput Mortem so deliberately, there's not really much of a clean up phase here. We're just going to get a Q-tip lightly dampened with spirits, reactivate any wash that went where we didn't want it, and clean it off with the dry side. I'll just let the video play here so you can see the way that I approach this technique. For our second colour filter on the skin, we're going to come in with Villainy Ink Phase 2 Umbral Nightshade. This is a really nice dark blue indigo hue, which also has a lot of pigmentation. It's a fantastic wash and absolutely brilliant when paired with Caput Mortem for flesh. I apply this neat and very deliberately just to the deeper recesses where we applied the Caput Mortem earlier. These two colours will blend together effortlessly, giving us a really nice varied, mottled and necrotic look to the flesh. And as with the previous step, we're just going to come in with a Q-tip lightly dampened with spirits to clean off any excess. You can see here just how nicely these two colours mix together. These are going to be a staple for me moving forward for any flesh work. To add some more depth, detail and character into the skin, we're going to come in with some blood effects. For this, I'm using Carrion Crimson. My first application is thinned slightly and applied like a glaze to the areas that I want to imply inflamed skin, such as the knees and the elbows. My second application is going to be neat, and I concentrate this on areas like where the horns and the spikes come out of the skin, around the mouth, the eye sockets, anywhere that I want to look really bloody. As with the previous two stages, we're just going to come in with a Q-tip lightly dampened with spirits and clean up any excess. For the final blood effect, I'm going to add a touch of Ichor of the Damned to the Carrion Crimson and come back in for a detailing pass. This is applied neat to the areas that I want that really dark, nasty, coagulated blood style look. I pay close attention to the mouth and the teeth here to give him the look that he's been feasting on some human flesh. Once applied, we can come in with a clean, fine tip brush, pick up some of the pigmentation found in Carrion Crimson and move it around, creating a really nice mottled look. To address the eyes on this big guy, I came in with some bold titanium white on a fine tip liner brush and dotted in both of the eyeballs. I then followed this up with Ammo Atom Red. This looks quite bright to start with, but we'll darken it down and make it more menacing in the next step. To do this, I come in with some slightly thinned Ichor of the Damned and apply it to the entirety of the eye socket, including the eyeballs. This will add contrast and a slight sheen and give those eyes that shadowy, menacing look. Our final step for the skin today is going to be popping some very subtle highlights. For this, I use a very light dry brush using Abtalung 502 light flesh tone. I remove 99% of the pigment from my brush and then just do a few very soft downward strokes over the prominent details. After this, I come in with a soft, clean and dry brush and gently feather these areas, creating a really smooth blend. I then use the same technique and colour to add some very sparse highlights to the shawl. Moving on to some of our final effects here today, I'm going to come in and add some decay. I thin this down very slightly and apply it with a large brush in a stippling manner to the cape, concentrating mainly on the bottom where it touches the ground. To blend this into the surrounding areas a little bit, I come in with a brush slightly dampened with spirits and use a stippling motion, just cleaning off any hard edges. Coming back in with some neat decay of death, I move over to the shawl. I concentrate mainly on the bottom here again, but also go about adding a few random patches here and there. And finally, I repeat the same process, but this time on the areas of fur. I want this to look really mangy and matted, so I'll go fairly heavy with this application. Coming back in with a brush and some spirits, I set about the shawl and the fur, breaking up any hard edges where we applied the decay. The subdued, powdery, greenish grey finish this gives is absolutely fantastic. You'll also notice here that the Caput Mortem and Carrying Crimson steps I carried out on the skin, I also applied to the severed heads on his back. One of the final steps here today, and to add some extra contrast to certain areas, is coming in with a crevice wash of slightly thinned Ichor of the Damned. I apply this to anywhere that I think needs darkening up a tad, and also as a pin wash to separate one part of the miniature from the next. Now we're on the home straight, I'm going to come in and add a few areas of surface finish variation. First of all, I apply some satin varnish to all of the gems. Moving over to gloss varnish, I concentrate mainly on the lower jaw, the mouth and the teeth to give that feral bloody look, and I also apply some to the areas of skin where the horns are breaking through. And finally, I come in with some ultra matte varnish and stipple it on in random patches on the shawl. This will help push the look of it being old, decrepit and dusty. And here is Ushoran in all of his undead, grimdark and vampiric glory. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed today's video. For many more like it, head on over to the Grimdark Compendium now, where you still have some time to catch a great bargain in our winter sale. I bid you a good week, keep it grim, and I will see you next time.